When Linda passed away, I thought the silence in the house would be the hardest thing to live with. Turns out it wasn't. It was what came after. My son Mark started visiting more often, offering to help with bills, insurance, and the house paperwork. I trusted him. He was all I had left. But little by little, things changed. Bank statements stopped coming to my address. My name disappeared from the property records, and before I knew it, I was being told to move out. By my own son. I didn't yell, didn't argue. I just packed my things and left the house I'd built with my wife. Everyone thought I'd lost everything. But they were wrong. Because Linda, she left me one last gift. A letter and a will that changed everything. Transition. The story begins quietly, with loss, but ends with truth reclaiming its place. When Linda died, the house felt like a room someone had left in a hurry. Chairs tucked wrong, a scarf draped over the back of a chair. A single cup on the counter, with lipstick caught on the rim, as if she'd stepped away and would come back any minute. For the first week after the funeral, I would stand in the doorway of our bedroom and just listen. There was a sound missing from the house that I'd taken for granted my whole life. The soft shuffle of her slippers down the hallway, the particular rhythm of her humming while she folded laundry, the way she used to call my name when the porch light flicked on. I found myself saying her name out loud sometimes, like a test, and the house would answer with nothing. I'd been a carpenter most of my working life, hands that know wood grade, and how to coax a stubborn door hinge back into line. That work kept me steady. It gave me purpose. After Linda was gone, I kept busy with the kind of tasks that made me feel close to her. Tightening loose screws around the house, fixing the kitchen cabinet doors that always stuck in the damp of late summer, trimming the roses she loved until they stood a little straighter. I'd whittle away at the list of chores like a man sanding down a rough edge, trying to smooth the sharpness of morning grief. The garden was the hardest and the kindest thing at the same time. Linda had planted most of it, marigolds by the path, lavender by the back gate, and those stubborn roses that fought every winter, and came back in spring. I would go out at dawn with a thermos of coffee, and tend to them the way she used to, talking out loud like the plants needed, reminders to keep growing. "You hold on now," I'd say, pruning dead blooms. Linda would want it this way. The dirt under my nails felt honest. It was work I could measure and understand, when everything else felt immeasurable. Mark was there more in those early weeks than I expected. My boy, my only child, who lived an hour away with his own life, had started showing up with boxes and casseroles, and a smile that tried too hard to look steady. At first I welcomed it like a guest. You're glad to see, the way you're glad to hear an old song on the radio. He'd come by on Thursdays to help mow the lawn, or on Saturdays to take the old truck to the shop. He'd sit in the kitchen, help with the paperwork, and we'd talk about ordinary things. The weather, what needed fixing, the neighbor's dog that kept digging up the hydrangeas. I was grateful. Grief makes you hungry for company. He helped me with the estate paperwork too. There's always a mess of forms after someone passes, insurance notices, letters from Social Security, the bank asking questions you don't have the heart to answer right away. Mark would spread pages across the table and go through them with a patience I admired. "We'll get this sorted, Dad," he'd say, folding his hands in that way. He used to when we were kids, and he wanted me to trust him. "You don't have to worry about a thing." I believed him. How could I not? Grief has a way of making you trust the people who are there. We ate a lot of reheated casseroles in those days. The house smelled like comfort food and old conversations. At first, Mark's presence felt like repair. He would sit on the porch with me and listen to me talk about Linda, those small stories that meant more than anything else. "Remember when she drove the truck over the mailbox?" I'd say, and we'd both laugh until tears came. We had our moments of silence too, the heavy kind that sits between people who share a loss. I didn't pay attention to small things at first. The way he took the mail before I could. The way he said, "I'll take care of that," with a tone that made the words final. Days turned into weeks, and the routine of his visits settled into the house like a new piece of furniture. He fixed the leaky faucet in the sink, replaced the screen on the back door, tightened the bolts on the swing. He took the trucking for oil changes, and would come back with stories about the mechanic, and a grin that sounded tired. Those things were helpful. They made the days less hollow. But beneath each helpful act, there was a slow change, like the tide that creeps up the beach. Steady, almost invisible, if you're not looking for it. There were signs I should have noticed sooner. He started handling the bank calls. "I'll speak with them, Dad. Don't worry," he said, picking up the phone the way he used to when he was a kid. And I told him to be brave. I trusted him with passwords and account numbers, because Linda wasn't here to do those things anymore, and I was getting tired. He set up online access for me on the computer, showed me how to check statements, and I nodded like a man who wanted to understand, but mostly, I trusted him to do it well. That trust came from a lifetime of being his father, of fixing bikes and setting rules, and showing up to his school's events. It felt natural to let him take over. Evenings were the worst. The house was too quiet when I was alone. I would cook enough for both of us, set an extra plate, and then remember he was gone for the night. When he was there, the loneliness folded a little. We would sit and watch some old ball game on TV, the sound low, and talk about nothing of importance. "You taking your heart medicine?" he asked sometimes, and I'd grumble and say, "Yes, Mark," because those small exchanges were the stitches holding the day together. Until one morning, I walked into the kitchen, and found the lock on the pantry door different. It was a small thing, a brass cylinder, that didn't match the others, but it made me stop mid-step. I ran my hand along the edge of the door, and felt the newness of it, as if someone had been in the pantry when I wasn't looking. I asked Mark when he came over that day, and he said it was to keep things tidy, to keep the mice out. Nodded and told myself I was being foolish. He'd do things without asking because he cared, right? He would keep the home safe. That's what he said. Then there was the time I reached for an old pocket watch Linda had loved and found it missing from the drawer. I asked Mark about it, trying to keep my voice even. "You moved things around, Dad," he said, and there was no gentleness in it, only a firmness that stung. "I put some things in storage. You were getting forgetful with the drawers." I felt a coldness in my chest, like the first time the heat goes out in winter. Forgetful, the word landed on me, like an accusation. I had always been the one who remembered where things were. I took pride in that. It felt like a small erasure. Little changes kept coming. He started stopping by my mailbox and sorting my letters. "You don't need to be bothered," he said. He would answer phones for me, decline invitations because, "Dad, you need rest." He became the intermediary between me and the world, and I was grateful. But sometimes when I asked a question about a bill or a letter he'd already handled, he would say, "I already took care of it," with a tone that told me I should be relieved and move on. Relief began to feel like a curtain drawn between us. There were evenings when he'd stay later, and the house would feel smaller. I'd be in the living room, working on a small cabinet I was restoring, sanding, choosing a stain, with the radio low, and he'd be in the office sorting through papers. Occasionally, his voice would drift out, softer than usual, talking to someone on the phone or muttering about refinancing and taxes. Once I overheard his half of the conversation. "We can get a better rate if we move the title," he said. The rest was muffled. I remember my hands going still, the sandpaper falling silent in my fingers. I didn't confront him then. There's a peculiar thing grief does. It makes you hold your breath in hopes the world will breathe back for you. I let the moment pass, and I went back to my work. Friends came by. Old neighbors brought casseroles like they always did. Mrs. Hargrove from down the lane sat with me on the porch one afternoon and said, "He's a good boy, Harold. He's just trying to help." Her kindness was a balm. People explained and excused. They assumed Mark's involvement was a natural step, a caring son doing what sons do. And to be fair, much of it was that. He was helpful, and I wasn't ungrateful. But gratitude doesn't make you blind. There were nights when the house had finally settled after a day of things done by other hands, that I felt a small, steady worry I couldn't quite name. I would sit with a cup of coffee and stare at a photograph of Linda on the mantel, and in the glass of the frame I'd sometimes see the reflection of the room behind me, and not recognize it immediately. A cushion where she would sit was pushed to one side, a vase rearranged. Little shifts like a slow shuffle of furniture in a living room you thought you knew by heart. On one of those nights, Mark brought a stack of forms for me to initial. They were the usual: bank notices, a refinance application, paperwork that needed a signature. He explained everything with a calm, practiced voice. "It's just to make it easier, Dad," he said. "We can reduce the payments, manage the estate better." I signed or initialed the pages because his explanation made sense, and because my arm felt heavier carrying worry than the weight of a pen. I trusted him. I thought I was doing the sensible thing. After he left that night, I sat in the dark and turned the papers over, reading them alone by the window light. My eyes tracked lines I hadn't noticed before, phrases about transfer of title pending and temporary power of attorney, legal terms that felt like foreign languages. I read them again, slowly, hoping a phrase would resolve into something friendlier, but the words were plain. In the court of small towns and long marriages, words like temporary and pending can be the beginning of things that grow while you sleep. I laid the papers on the table and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. My mind worked like a clock with a loose gear, ticking in odd patterns. I thought of Linda folding napkins and humming in the kitchen, the way she used to straighten the tablecloth to make everything even. I remembered proving a joint for a porch swing when we were first married, measuring and smoothing and clamping, until it sat exactly right. That care felt far away now, and an ache rose in my chest, less a burning and more a dull, persistent thud. The next morning when I opened the mailbox, there was a stack of mail addressed to me, and one envelope with the bank's return address, stamped and official. I felt my hands go a little cold. I read the headline, "Account Status Update, Important Notice," then turned the envelope over. The paper inside had small print and numbers that I squinted to make out. It spoke of changes of account consolidation. My first instinct was to call Mark and ask what this meant. Then I paused. Asking felt like admitting I didn't know what had become of things I'd assumed were steady. Pride and grief tangled together in that pause. I made coffee and sat on the porch. The roses were coming along. The sun touched the tips of their petals and made them glow, and for a minute the world felt ordinary. But when Mark came over that afternoon, I watched his hands move with the familiarity of someone in a house, as if he had always been the one to set things right. He smiled and told me he'd spoken to the bank. "Everything's fine, Dad," he said. "We're just getting things in order. You don't have to worry about a thing." There was a note of certainty in his voice that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with control. I nodded, because what else does a man do in his 60s, whose hands still remember how to fix things, but whose heart is still trying to learn a new language of loss and trust? I trusted him. I wanted to trust him, but a small seed of unease had taken root, and even as I sat there sipping my coffee, tending the roses as Linda taught me, I felt the house edging away from me, inch by inch. Kindness, I would learn, can sometimes carry a weight that looks like care, but feels like something else, ownership. And slowly, almost without either of us noticing, kindness began to shift toward control. It's funny how control can sneak into your life disguised as kindness. It doesn't happen overnight. It slides in quietly, one small favor at a time, until you're standing in a home that doesn't quite feel like yours anymore. That's how it went with Mark. At first I was grateful. He started taking care of things that used to weigh me down. He'd come by every few days, bringing folders, envelopes, or receipts. "You shouldn't worry about these things, Dad," he'd say, pulling up a chair at the kitchen table, spreading everything out in neat rows. "Property taxes, insurance renewals, online banking, it's all a mess. I'll keep it organized." And I believed him. Why wouldn't I? Grief had worn me down. After Linda passed, I wasn't the same. I still got up early every morning, still made my coffee the way she liked it, 2 scoops of sugar, even though I never had much of a sweet tooth. I'd sit at the kitchen table, watching the steam rise from the cup, telling myself that keeping up her routines somehow kept her close. So when Mark said, "You don't have to handle it all alone," I let him. I told myself that this was what family was for. He'd take the bills, the statements, even the junk mail that piled up on the counter. Some days I didn't even look through them anymore. He'd assure me he'd already handled it, and I wanted to believe that was enough. Over time, little things started to shift, things that weren't supposed to. The first was the mail. It stopped showing up. I figured it was just the post office being slow, or maybe the mail carrier changing routes. But then weeks went by. Not a single envelope with my name on it. When I asked Mark, he smiled easily and said, "I redirected everything to my address, just to make it easier to sort through. You don't have to worry about it." That phrase, "you don't have to worry about it," started to echo through the house like a clock, ticking in an empty room. At first it sounded like care. Later, it sounded like control. Then there were the locks. One afternoon, I came home from the grocery store to find that the front door key didn't turn the same way it used to. It caught halfway through, like the mechanism was unfamiliar. When I mentioned it to Mark, he brushed it off. I replaced it. The old one was sticking. I made new keys. Here. He handed me one on a small silver ring. "Only you and I have them," he said. But the thing is, I never saw him replace the lock. And later that week, I found another door. This time the side door to the garage changed too. He was always quick to explain things, faster than I could question. "Dad, you know how people are these days. We need better security." That word, we started to fade from our conversations. It became I and you. "I handled the taxes, Dad. I talked to the bank. You don't need to do that anymore." The tone changed first. The warmth that used to be there, those small traces of a son talking to his father, was replaced with something quieter, colder, polite, but clipped, like a banker or a doctor reading a chart. Sometimes he'd come by and rearrange things without asking. I find my old tools in the shed packed away in boxes labeled in his handwriting. The pantry shelves were cleared out one day, replaced with new containers, new labels. "Makes it easier to keep track of everything," he said. But what I noticed was that it didn't look like Linda's kitchen anymore. It looked like something out of a catalogue. Tidy, impersonal, unfamiliar. And then one day I realized her jewelry box was gone. It had been sitting on the dresser since the day she died. I never opened it, couldn't bring myself to. The sight of it was enough. I would dust around it, carefully, every Sunday morning, the way she used to dust the picture frames. But when I went to wipe it down that morning, the space was empty. I stood there for a long time, my hand still holding the cloth, staring at the faint square outline where it used to be. When I asked Mark about it later, he didn't hesitate. "I put it in storage," he said, not looking at me. Didn't want anything valuable lying around. Nodded, but something inside me sank. He didn't say Mum's jewelry. He said anything valuable. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. They were just things, but they weren't. Those small objects carried a life. Hers, ours. Every time he moved something, it felt like another part of her was fading out of the room. There was another sign I almost missed. The bills. The lights flickered one evening, and when I called the power company, they said the payment had bounced. "There's been a mix-up," the woman on the phone told me. "The account was recently updated." Updated. That was the word that made my stomach drop. When I told Mark, he frowned. "I've been handling those payments, Dad. It's fine, I'll fix it." But that night, lying awake in bed, I realized something strange. I didn't even know which bank account my bills were coming from anymore. I couldn't remember the last time I'd written a check. Grief can make you tired in ways people don't talk. It's not just sadness. It's a heaviness that makes you give up the small arguments because you're too worn out to fight for them. I let him take more control because I didn't have the strength to question it. I told myself I was lucky to have a son who cared. But the more control he took, the smaller my world became. He started showing up unannounced, letting himself in with those new keys. Sometimes I'd wake up and hear movement downstairs before dawn, the sound of drawers opening, papers shifting. When I'd come down, he'd be sitting at the table with his laptop, saying, "Just checking some things, Dad. Go back to sleep." The strangest thing was how natural he made it all seem. He'd smile that same polite smile he used to have as a boy when he was hiding something. Back when he'd break a window and say, "It was already cracked, Dad." I recognized that look now, years later, but this time I didn't know what he was breaking. I started to notice the way he spoke to me, changed too, slower, like I needed things explained to me, like I wasn't capable anymore. "Don't worry about that, Dad," he'd say, tilting his head slightly, his voice almost soothing. "I've already taken care of it. You just relax." The word relax used to mean rest. Now it sounded like a command. There was a Sunday morning not long after that, when I really felt it, when the shift became undeniable. The day started like any other. The air smelled like cut grass and coffee. The sunlight came through the blinds, dust mites floating like gold in the beans. I made breakfast, cracked 2 eggs into a pan, poured her favorite mug of coffee, even though she wasn't there. Old habits die hard. When I went to get the sugar from the cabinet, it wasn't there. The jars were different. The shelves rearranged. The coffee tins, the plates, everything had been moved. The curtains were new, too, thinner, the kind you buy in bulk from department stores. Linda's lace ones were gone. I looked around the kitchen and felt something strange rising in my chest. Everything was familiar, yet nothing belonged to me. The table I built myself had a new cloth over it. The radio she used to play while baking was unplugged. Even the smell was different, cleaner, sharper, like lemon polish, instead of the faint scent of flower and lavender that used to linger. I stood there for a long moment, coffee cup in hand, staring at the space where Linda's recipe box used to be. My own handwriting was on the wood of that table, from the day I sanded it smooth. My name was still on the deed, though I was starting to wonder how much that really meant. I thought about asking Mark why everything felt so different, why he had to change even the small things that held her memory. But when I tried to bring it up later, he smiled that calm, practiced smile, and said, "Dad, I just want to make things easier for you. The house needs to be practical now. You don't have to hold on to everything. Practical." That word landed like a nail being driven into soft wood. That night, I walked through the house alone, touching the furniture, the door frames, the old walls. Every creak in the floor used to sound like home. Now it sounded like distance. I ran my hand over the banister. I built with Linda watching, her hands on her hips, telling me it was slightly crooked. "It gives it character," she used to say. Now, even that banister felt foreign, polished differently, too smooth. Grief, I learned, isn't just losing the person. It's losing the small, familiar world you built with them. And sometimes the person you trust most, your own child, becomes the one quietly dismantling that world piece by piece. The next morning, I came downstairs and stood in the middle of the kitchen, the same kitchen I'd built cabinets for 40 years ago. I looked around and realized something simple and terrible at the same time. Nothing here belonged to me anymore. Not the sounds, not the smell, not even the air felt like it fit in my lungs. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about loss anymore. Something deeper was shifting, and I could feel the foundation of everything I'd built start to move under my feet. It happened on a Wednesday. Funny how you remember days like that. Nothing special about it. Just an ordinary mid-morning with the smell of fresh coffee and a chill in the air that hinted at early fall. I was sitting by the kitchen window, watching a few leaves tumble across the yard, when Mark came in. He had that same confident stride he picked up lately, the one that made him look less like a son visiting and more like someone inspecting his property. He didn't bother with small talk that morning. No, "How'd you sleep, Dad?" or "Want me to pick up anything from town?" He just stood there with a manila folder tucked under his arm, eyes steady and unreadable. I knew that look. It was the same look he used to get when he was a boy and wanted to tell me something he knew I wouldn't like the time he broke the neighbor's window and tried to blame the wind. He pulled out a few papers and laid them on the table between us. The same table Linda and I had eaten breakfast at for 40 years. The papers looked out of place there, like weeds growing through a garden path. "Dad," he started, his voice calm, but tight, "we need to talk about the house." I didn't move. I just watched his hands. The way his fingers smoothed the papers, careful, deliberate, almost rehearsed. "What about it?" I asked. He looked at me like he was explaining something simple to a stubborn child. "The house is in my name now," he said. "It's for your safety, for refinancing purposes. You'll still live here. Nothing changes." For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. My hearing isn't what it used to be, but I know what words sound like when they break something inside you. I stared at him, and everything around us went still. "My name," I said slowly, "was on that deed since the day I built this place." He sighed. "And it's still your home, Dad. But with the economy the way it is, and your age, it just made more sense for me to take ownership. It'll protect you, keep things easier down the line." Easier down the line. He said it like a man reciting from a script. I reached for the papers, but he slid them slightly out of reach. Not aggressive, just subtle enough to make the message clear. I could feel something in my chest tightening, like the first few drops of rain before a storm. "Mark," I said quietly, "you changed the name on the deed. It's still our house," he said quickly, his tone growing sharp at the edges. "You're making this bigger than it is. I'm helping you. Helping me." That word again. Helping. I stood, slowly, the old floorboards creaking under my weight. "You went behind my back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You took the one thing your mother and I built together, our life's work, and you put it in your name." He ran a hand through his hair and sighed. "Dad, you're not thinking clearly. You've been overwhelmed since Mum died. I just wanted to make sure you were taken care of. Taken care of. As if I were a burden, not a father." There was a silence between us then, thick and heavy. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the old clock Linda had loved. The air felt too tight to breathe. Finally, I said, "You don't take care of people by taking away their home." His jaw tightened. He looked past me, toward the window, as if looking me in the eye was harder than saying what came next. "You'll be more comfortable somewhere smaller, Dad," he said. "A place that's easier to manage. There's a retirement complex just outside of town. Nice people. Lots of activities. I already toured it for you." I felt the room tilt slightly. "You did what?" "It's for your own good," he said firmly now. "You'll have meals, medical care if you need it. Company." "Company," I interrupted. My voice cracked on the word. You think I need company more than I need my home." He shook his head, frustrated. "Dad, you're being unreasonable. I can't keep driving out here every week to check on you, handle the bills, fix things around the house. It's too much. You're not the same as you used to be. You need help." There it was. The final blow. You need help. It's strange how words can bruise without ever being shouted. He wasn't angry. He was composed, logical, maybe even convinced he was right. But what I heard was, "You're not capable. You're not needed. You're done." I walked past him to the living room, every step heavier than the last. My eyes fell on the photos lining the mantel. Linda and me at our wedding, her holding baby Mark in her arms, the three of us standing in front of the house before the porch was built. Every nail in that frame, every piece of wood in those walls, I had set with my own hands. And now, standing there, I felt like a guest in the only place I'd ever truly belonged. When I turned back, Mark was watching me with something that almost looked like pity. "I'll take care of everything," he said. "All you have to do is pack a few things. I'll handle the rest." For a moment, I wanted to argue, to tell him no, to remind him that I wasn't weak, that I'd built this home from the ground up, that I'd raised him here with the same hands that still had strength in them. But then I saw the look in his eyes, steady, resolved, the kind that doesn't bend once it's made up its mind. So I didn't fight. I just nodded once and walked upstairs to pack. It took me longer than it should have. Every drawer I opened was memory. Linda's old scarves, the quilts she'd sewn the year Mark went to college, the smell of cedar from the wardrobe we'd shaved for decades. I folded things carefully, more out of habit than need. When I came across her perfume bottle, nearly empty, I slipped it into my jacket pocket. It still smelled faintly of lavender, and something softer, something like home. By the time I came downstairs, Mark was already stacking boxes by the door. He'd moved quickly, almost eagerly. There was something unsettling about how efficient he was, like he'd been waiting for this moment. "Your new place is nice," he said, forcing a smile. "Close to the park. You'll like it." I looked around the room one last time. The late afternoon light was spilling across the floorboards, catching dust in the air. It was the same light that used to fall on Linda when she sat reading by the window, her legs curled under her coffee cup beside her. I could almost see her, there again, smiling, peaceful. I wanted to say goodbye to her out loud, but my throat wouldn't let me. Instead, I placed my hand on the wall near the doorway, feeling the texture of the paint under my palm, the familiar roughness where the plaster had cracked years ago. "Goodbye, sweetheart," I whispered under my breath. Mark didn't hear me, or maybe he did, and chose to ignore it. He drove me to the new place in silence. It wasn't far, 15 minutes outside town, but it felt like crossing a lifetime. The building was clean, modern, and completely void of soul. Rows of identical beige doors, the faint hum of televisions behind them, the smell of disinfectant and microwave dinners in the air. The manager met us at the front desk, with a smile that was too bright, too practiced. "Welcome, Mr. Lawson," she said. "We're happy to have you. Happy to have me." Like I was being adopted by strangers. Mark carried in the last of my boxes, set them down by the window and dusted his hands off. "You'll be okay here, Dad," he said. "They'll take good care of you." I nodded, because that's what you do when you realize arguing won't change anything. He hugged me briefly, one of those quick, polite hugs that feel more like a formality than affection, and left. I listened to his footsteps fade down the hall, then the click of the elevator door closing, and just like that, I was alone. The apartment was small. One room, a kitchenette, a single window overlooking a parking lot. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the mattress still wrapped in plastic, and looked around. It felt temporary, like a waiting room for someone else's life. For a long time I just sat there. The clock ticked, the refrigerator hummed, and in the quiet, I could almost hear Linda's voice again, faint but steady. "Don't let him take everything that matters, Harold." I don't know if it was memory or imagination, but it was enough to make me stand up and walk to the box marked papers. I pulled it open and began to sift through the stacks. Old insurance letters, tax forms, a few envelopes I didn't recognize. It wasn't that I expected to find anything specific. I just needed to do something, to touch what was left of my life, to feel close to her in the only way I still could. The papers smelled faintly of dust and time. Some of them were yellowed at the edges, others still crisp. I found her handwriting on the corners of a few, little notes like, "Keep copy," or "Ask bank about policy." I ran my thumb over the ink, imagining her sitting at this same table years ago, organized as always, trying to make sure we were protected from every possibility. As I looked through them, one envelope caught my eye. It was older, tucked deep in the stack, marked with her handwriting, familiar, slanted, graceful. The sight of it made my heart stutter. It wasn't the time yet to open it, but I knew then, deep down, that somewhere in that pile of papers, Linda had left something behind for me. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt something stir that wasn't grief or anger. It was something quieter, steadier. The beginning of understanding. I sat there until the sun went down, surrounded by her photographs, the boxes of our life, and that small whisper of hope hidden somewhere in the paperwork she'd left behind. The night I found Linda's envelope, the world felt like it had tilted back into place for the first time since he drove away with the last of my boxes. I was sitting on the edge of that cheap mattress, in the little room, the complex called an apartment, the kind of place that smells faintly of bleach and old carpet. The TV was off. The lights in the hallway had that steady, indifferent glow. They always have in places like that. I'd been going through the box of papers all afternoon, the same stack I'd brought with me when Mark left, touching the corners as if the paper itself might still hold a shape of our life. I'd put off opening the old wooden chest for weeks. It had belonged to Linda's grandmother, a heavy, stubborn thing with iron hinges and a carved heart on the lid. It sat by her sewing table like a small island in the corner of our bedroom, and every time I walked past, I felt the weight of it. That night, when the clock on the wall ticked toward midnight and sleep wouldn't come, I told myself I'd open one drawer, read one note, and then I'd go to bed. I knelt in front of the chest, the wood cool under my palms. The lid creaked the way it always had when Linda used to open it, and for a breath I pictured her hands, her fingers nimble and stained with thread, the little white calluses she always joked about. Inside, wrapped in a faded scarf with tiny roses on it, was a thin envelope. Her handwriting, the slanted, careful script I'd loved for years, said, "If anything happens to me." The words were small and private, like a secret left on the kitchen table. My hands shook a little as I eased the paper open. There was a folded document inside and a small note. The note was brief. "For Harold, keep this where you can find it. Love, L." And the paper smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Of home. I unfolded the document slowly. It was a will, notarized, stamped, with dates that made my chest tighten. Linda had written it years ago, the notary's seal crisp and undeniable at the bottom. My name was listed, in her hand, as the sole owner of the house. There was a clause, simple, legal-sounding, but clear, that required any transfer of the property to be authorized by me in person. In plain words, the house could not be moved out of our names without my explicit consent. She'd protected the house against being taken in her name or in mine, and she'd made sure it couldn't be quietly shifted around while I was vulnerable. For a long time I just sat there, the paper in my lap, letting the lines blur. Part of me wanted to laugh, low and helpless, or cry, or both. Mostly I felt stunned. How could she have known? How could she have imagined Mark's eyes becoming so quick and sure, his hands so ready to move things? Linda had always been sensible, practical in a way that looked calm on the surface and steady underneath. She was the one who balanced the checkbook, wrote reminders on the calendar, called the insurance company when the yearly notice came in. But this careful legal protection was a kind of foresight I had reservations about even admitting existed. I remember thinking about the days when she'd sat across from me at the kitchen table, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron, as she worried about small things like the roof or the aging boiler. "People are strange when they think you're weak," she'd say sometimes, half joking. But there was a serious line in her voice I'd always brushed aside. I suppose she'd been saving me from my own kindness. She always said I trusted too easily. Now I understood what she meant. She had taken care of the one thing she knew I would not know how to guard. There was a sundown sort of quiet in the little room, as I reread the will for the 100th time. The legal words were simple, but their meaning was anything but. Linda's signature felt like a hand returned to rest on my shoulder. She had thought of everything, had written instructions that would keep the house anchored to me, even if the tide around it tried to sweep things away. The clause about transfer without consent was a small, sturdy lock in ink. I folded the paper back along its creases and slipped it inside my jacket without thinking. My fingers smelled of the faded scarf and that paring down of grief you get when your hands are busy with something real. I could feel a warmth spread, not pride, not bragging, but a quiet, steady relief, the way you feel when you find a spare tool you thought you'd lost. The relief was small and fragile, but it was real. It made the air in the room feel a little less like a room rented for the night, and more like a place with a history. Sleep didn't come. I lay awake until long past midnight, the will tucked under my pillow like a talisman. My mind moved through memories the way hands move over old wood, tracing the joints, feeling for the seams. I thought of the first time we cleared the lot where the house stands now. We'd been young, unnervingly bold. We'd done the work ourselves, digging, measuring, arguing, and laughing over mistakes and successes. Linda had packed lunches in an old cooler, and we'd eat those sandwiches sitting on the unfinished porch. Who knew a lifetime could be built on sandwiches and stubbornness? That memory steadied me, in a way tears could not. Around 3 the morning I got up, made tea, and sat by the window. The sky was the kind of black that made the stars look near enough to touch. A truck passed on the road outside, and the sound faded into the distance. I took the will out, read it again, and let the words find their place inside me. Linda's foresight felt like a kind of justice, wrapped in gentleness, the way removing a stone from a boot prevents a blister days from now. She had planned for me in a way that did not require me to be shrewd or suspicious. She had shouldered the foresight, and in doing so, she had given me the ability to be something else, clear-headed and slow, but not helpless. Morning came cold and grey. For a while, I just sat and watched the light change in the small room. It wasn't anger, though I felt that too, a tight, bright thing that you can feel at the back of your throat. It was steadier than anger, a resolve that was quieter, more careful. Linda's planning had given me something steadier than fury. It had given me a plan. I made a list as soon as I could hold a pen steady, find the lawyer we used years back, request copies of any deeds and mortgage papers, see what the bank had been told, learn what steps are required to enforce the will. Each small task felt like a step forward across a room after someone has shut the lights. I told myself I would move slowly and do things right. Linda had always hated shortcuts that cut corners in ways no one noticed until they mattered. I would honor that. There was a moment, sitting there with that list, and the cup of tea cooling by my hand, when I felt something like gratitude, so sharp it surprised me. Not the easy kind of gratitude you give in polite conversation, but a deep, visceral thanks. For a woman who had thought of me when she could no longer speak for herself. I thought of her hands folded under the scarf in the chest, and of the way she'd winked at me over a pot of soup. How many small acts of love had gone unnoticed in our days? How many quiet arrangements had she made to keep us whole? This was the most important of them. I called the lawyer's office that morning while the world was still waking. The woman who answered recognized the name right away. Linda had been known in town, not only for her pies, but for being the kind of person who kept her affairs tidy. "We've got everything on file," she said, and I could hear the slight hesitation in her voice, as if she had expected the day to arrive, but was still preparing herself for what would come next. She asked me to come in the next day, to bring whatever documents I had. She said she would pull the old file. Hearing those words made my chest ache, and my hand steady in the same breath. The rest of the day I moved with a kind of careful purpose. I called a few old friends, told them I was okay, that I had things to do. I walked the route Linda and I had taken every morning for years, down past the post office by the bakery, with its familiar smell of yeast, the corner where the maples leaned in. People nodded and said their small, polite things. No one knew. No one could know yet what sat in my jacket like a private seed waiting to sprout. When I returned to the little apartment that night, the will was fingered and smoothed, and, for the first time since Linda's funeral, the shape of what I would do next felt less like influence and more like a choice. I would not scream. I would not grab for drama. Linda's paper had given me the authority to move carefully, legally, and with the kind of steady patience I'd learned from sanding a stubborn joint until it fit. I would let truth do its work, folded the will and tucked it into the chest's lining for safekeeping, then closed the lid. The wood was warm from the day's sun that had filtered through the drapes earlier. I paused with my hand on the lid and felt a small private smile come to me. Not because anything was simple, but because something had been done right by someone I loved. Linda had protected our home in the way she could, quietly, lovingly, with an eye for the practical that had always balanced her heart. That night I slept a little easier. The resolve that had woken in me that morning settled into a patient readiness. In the days to come, I would learn the rhythms of legal filing, of letters and certified mail, of names and dates and signatures. I would set up meetings and walk into offices where people would read and nod and do the work their professions required. I would not about it. I would be deliberate. Linda had left me not only a document, but a way to act that respected who we had been and who I still was. For the first time in months, the grief that lived in my chest shifted into something else, an energy that felt like protection more than pain. Linda had handed me a tool, quietly, while she could. Now it was my turn to use it. When I walked into Mr. Davenport's little law office, it felt like stepping back into a quieter part of the town's history. He'd been Linda's lawyer for years, the man of neat suits, slow hands, and the sort of steady voice that made you think the world would keep on being sensible if he had any say in it. The office smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. There were books stacked on the shelves that looked like they had been read by generations. I kept the will in the inside pocket of my jacket, feeling its weight like a small secret. He looked up from his desk, and for a moment I could see the surprise on his face. "Harold," he said, standing to greet me. "I hadn't heard from you in a while. How are you managing?" He asked it kindly, the way an old neighbor does, not prying, but present. I placed the envelope on his desk. "Linda left me this," I said. "I found it in the chest by the sewing table." He took it gently, his fingers careful, and opened it with the kind of attention you give a fragile thing. He read, then read again, and his face went soft and thoughtful. "She was very careful," he said. "Linda always was." Then he pushed his glasses up and looked at me. "We'll need to pull the property records, Harold. If this is notarized as it appears, it gives you a strong position, but we should see what else is in the public record." We sat together and made a plan, the kind you make for a long job, that needs patience. He told me what steps we'd take: request copies of the deed from the county office, check for any recorded transfers, ask the bank for documents related to any mortgage changes, and subpoena any paperwork that may have been filed under Mark's name. I nodded and felt a steadying sense of purpose. It was work, not drama. It was the kind of work my hands liked: small, exacting, useful. He asked me a few questions about the days before Linda died, about any conversations I'd had with Mark about the house, and whether I'd signed anything recently. I told him everything I could remember: the nights I'd slept poorly, the papers Mark had set in front of me, the way he'd said help so often that it had come to mean the right to make decisions for me. Mr. Davenport listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands on the desk, like someone who was collecting pieces to fit into a puzzle. "Harold," he said finally, "it's possible your wife's will is enough, but we should be careful. There are folks who are quick with paperwork, and some of them have a way of making things look proper when they are not." His voice was steady and not unkind. "If there's anything forged or falsified, we'll find it. It'll take time, but the law moves in its own rhythm, and sometimes that rhythm favors someone who has been patient and honest." We started small. He made a few calls while I sat in his office, and felt like a man who had been handed a map. He called the county recorder and asked them to pull the current deed. He called contacts at the bank and explained gently that I was bringing in a document that might affect title. He told me to sleep, to eat, to not make any sudden moves. It was strange to be told to rest when all I felt like doing was walking back to the house to see if the walls still remembered Linda's laugh, but his confidence was a comfort. The first week was full of waiting and small confirmations. The county clerk's office sent over a copy of the deed. It did indeed show Mark as the current owner. But with Mr. Davenport by my side, we requested copies of everything filed in the months leading up to and following the funeral. It didn't take long for him to point out something that made the hair on my arm stand up. There were signatures on some of the documents that did not match mine, nor did they appear in Linda's handwriting. They were similar enough if you only glanced, but a careful look showed differences: a loop in the H that I would never make, a hurried slant. Mr. Davenport made a note in his little book and said quietly, "This is worth investigating." We sent letters, certified, with return receipt requested, to anyone who might have handled the transfer: the title company, the bank, a local notary. I learned the meaning of phrases I had avoided for years: chain of title, power of attorney, consent of transfer. Mr. Davenport explained them like a man laying out tools. "We'll need originals," he said. "We'll have to see who actually signed. If Mark submitted forged documents, that will be a serious matter." It was not dramatic. There were no storming into rooms or shouting confrontations. Mostly there were quiet conversations on the phone, a lot of paper moving from one desk to another, and the steady work of professionals who do these things every day. I learned that the law is a slow, exacting instrument. It moves, not like a fist, but like a patient tide, inexorable, gradual, and inevitable in its own way. When the county sent over the original signed forms, Mr. Davenport and I sat at his desk and compared the signatures. There it was, enough discrepancy for an experienced eye, though not so blatant that a bank clerk would necessarily catch it. He made copies, labeled them carefully, and told me we would need to consult a handwriting expert to present in court. I felt a heavy mix of emotions: relief that there was evidence, anger at the betrayal, but underneath it all, a certain calm. Linda had left me the key. Now the work was to use it. There were more letters. I learned the small theatre of legal notice, a certified letter that announces the beginning of a process. Mr. Davenport prepared one and sent it to Mark, a request for confirmation of the transfer, copies of any documents he'd signed, and a polite but firm notice that I had a will that named me as the owner. I think it came as a shock to Mark. Perhaps he had assumed no one would look. Perhaps he had thought the house was already his in spirit, if not in law. The return receipt came back, signed with a name I recognized. Mr. Davenport filed a petition in the county court, requesting that the transfer be investigated and temporarily stayed. We had to show cause, present Linda's will, show the allegedly forged documents, and lay out the reasons for suspicion. The court date was set, for a few weeks out. In the meantime, papers arrived, some from the bank, some from Mark's lawyer, which was a polite, brief letter, suggesting that perhaps Mr. Davenport had misread things, and that I was being hasty. It felt like a child's protest in the face of a plan. I sat through the small hearings like someone who had built a house one board at a time, patiently, with an eye for details. The judge was an older woman who spoke plainly and listened carefully. She didn't seem impressed by the performance of lawyers or by the speed of anyone's emotion. She looked at facts and set dates. During the hearing, Mr. Davenport presented the will and the discrepancies we found. He spoke slowly and clearly, like he was tutoring the court in common sense. Mark's lawyer argued that the transfer had been voluntary and that any claims should be substantiated with proof. We had proof. We had Linda's signature, notarized, and a clause that read like a lock. The judge ordered that the transfer be stayed until the issues could be resolved. It was not an immediate victory, but it was a necessary one. It froze the situation long enough for truth to be discovered. The next few weeks were a fog of letters, phone calls, and meetings. Mr. Davenport set up a handwriting analysis. He subpoenaed bank records and copies of any forms filed with the title company. We collected receipts and old cancelled checks that showed patterns. I gave sworn statements, and Mr. Davenport coached me gently on what to say and how to stay calm. I practiced telling the story of the house, how Linda and I had built it, the way we'd measured door frames together, the lunches on the unfinished porch. In court, the small details mattered because they built a context that made the forgeries look not like a simple paperwork error, but a deliberate attempt to move the property without consent. Once the handwriting expert compared the signatures and produced a report, careful, academic, and damning, it shifted things further. He noted that one of the documents bore characteristics inconsistent with my signature and inconsistent with Linda's known hand. The expert's words carried weight. They were not angry. They were precise. He explained that the lines had been altered, that a forgery often shows hesitation where a genuine hand flows. When the report was filed, it felt like a hinge turning. The judge reviewed it and set a date for a more formal hearing. In that quiet period, while things moved through offices and files, I found myself doing the simple things, calling old friends to reassure them, walking the route Linda and I had walked for so long, and making lists of what needed to be done in the house if it returned to me. I made a plan to restore the garden the way she liked it, the way she'd taught me. Those plans were small anchors that kept me steady. People asked if I would confront Mark, and I said no. Confrontation would have been a loud thing, and the answer I wanted did not require noise. I wanted the law to speak, to peel the layers back. I wanted the truth, plain, unadored, to be what settled the matter. Besides, yelling at a man who had once been my boy would not bring back the days when he sat on the porch and told me how school had gone. It would not restore the evenings when Linda's laugh made the kitchen light up. I preferred the quiet work of proof. Finally, on a grey Thursday, a courier arrived at my apartment with a thick envelope. Mr. Davenport had called earlier to say that the court would issue a ruling, and that there was a good chance, given the evidence, that they would find the transfer void. I opened the envelope with hands that didn't tremble as much as they had before. Inside was a copy of the court order. The judge had found that the transfer contained documents with questionable signatures, and that, in light of Linda's notarized will, there was sufficient reason to nullify the earlier deed and restore the title to its prior status. The language was careful and precise. The kind of clean words that have the power to untangle messy human things. I sat back and, for the first time in many days, let myself breathe. It wasn't triumph so much as a long, deep exhale. Linda had provided the protection. Mr. Davenport had done the work. The court had spoken. The house, at least on paper, was mine again. The process had been slow and quietly painful in parts, but it had worked in the way slow things often do, with persistence and the small dignity of proof. A few weeks later, a court order is issued, transferring the house back to its rightful owner. When the letter from the court arrived, it felt like the tide finally turning after a long, patient pull. I read it twice on the kitchen table, the morning light slicing through the window and catching dust in the air, making the paper look somehow cleaner than it had any right to be. There were formal words in it: course, findings, orders, the careful language judges used to stitch things back together. But in the margin of my mind, what I heard was Linda's voice in the kitchen again, humming as she shelled peas. The document said the transfer was void, that the deed should be returned to the status it held before the paperwork was filed. In plain terms, the house was mine again. I didn't make a show of it. There was no brass band or sudden victory shout. Instead, I did what I'd always done when something needed fixing. I went to the shed and pulled out the toolbox. The hinge on the lower cabinet in the kitchen had been loose for a while. It had squeaked every time I opened it, and I'd promised myself that when the house was right again, I'd tighten it properly. It sounds small when I say it out loud, but those little things have a way of taking the weight off a place. So I sat at the workbench, sand under my nails, and set a new hinge with slow, exacting turns of the screwdriver. I took pleasure in the ordinary work, the way a screw finds its thread, the little satisfying click when the hinge is exactly where it should be. When the knock came at the front door, I wasn't surprised. I figured Mark would return. People often come back to places they think they've lost, sometimes to claim, sometimes to ask, sometimes to measure what they've done by the expression on another's face. I wiped my hands on a rag and went to open the door. He stood there the way he used to when he was a teenager, and I'd told him to mow the lawn. Awkward, a little defensive, shoulders hunched. He glanced at the house like a man checking the price tag on something he'd hoped no one else would notice. He looked older in the face than I felt. Perhaps it was just the lines worry can leave behind when a person doesn't sleep much, or when conscience keeps them up at night. There was no flourish, no accusation. When I opened the door, he stepped onto the porch and paused, taking in the sight of the house, as if it were both familiar and new at the same time. His eyes moved over the freshly tightened hinge where I'd been working, and then toward the front door, where a new, solid lock gleamed in the weak sun. Not bright, not showy, simply proper, heavy, the sort of lock you use when you mean to stay. "Dad," he said. His voice had the thinness of a man trying to keep something composed. "You're late," I said lightly, and there was no bite in it. I didn't want the first words to be the wrong ones. There was a steadiness about it. Instead, like the way you test a joint before you trust your weight to it. He stepped inside without being invited, the way sons sometimes do when homes feel like they still belong to them. He looked around, at the same porch we'd scraped paint off together a few summers ago, at the chair where Linda used to sit with her knitting, at the small stack of garden catalogues I'd been meaning to use. I watched him carefully, because years teach you that people show their intentions in tiny ways, the way they stand, the way they place their hands, the way they avoid and then seek eye contact. He cleared his throat. "I came to talk," he said. I nodded and gestured to the chair opposite mine. He sat heavily, as if the weight of the trip had been more than the drive. For a while we simply sat. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock on the mantel, all the ordinary sounds that matter more than they appear, filled the space between us. Then he spoke, and the words came too fast, as if speed might make them truer. "I know what happened," he said. I saw the notice about the court. Look, Dad. He stopped. There was a softness there that I hadn't seen in months, but it was colored with a confusion I couldn't quite place. I thought I was protecting you. Linda was gone, and I thought I'd do the sensible thing. Sensible for whom? I asked gently. He flinched, because the truth of that question is rarely comfortable. For you, for us. He searched my face for agreement and didn't find it. I thought the bank would be easier to deal with if the title was in my name. It was always the paperwork that... His voice trailed. He looked down at his hands, which had a few new calluses at the fingertips, the kind that come from work, not always told. I remembered the first time I taught him to hold a hammer properly, showed him how to drive a nail straight, so the wood would take it and not split. It seemed so long ago. You did it without asking, I said. My tone didn't rise. I didn't want anger to be the thing that filled this room. You took something I built with Linda. You moved the name without talking to me. He looked up, and there was a rawness in his eyes I hadn't expected. I thought you wanted to be safe. Whispered. I thought you'd be better off. The admission was small and wounded, like a child caught after a rule, broken in the name of love. We spoke for a long time after that, not really arguing, but working through the soft places of how we'd gotten here. He offered explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface and hollow underneath. I listened and let him say what he needed to say. Part of me was still his father, the man who'd once patched knees and fixed radios, and held him when a storm scared him at night. That father still exists, and I couldn't erase the years of care with a single frown. But another part of me held the ache of a man who'd watched someone he raised build walls around what mattered to him. When he finally rose to leave, he didn't speak of apologies that would never happen cleanly. He merely stood at the doorway, hand on the frame, as if feeling the grain of the wood could remind him what it was to belong somewhere, as opposed to owning something. I'm sorry, he said simply, and whatever else I might have wanted to say flowed away. We're all clumsy with the words that rearrange our lives. He left without slamming the door. He didn't need to. The click of the latch was final enough. Outside, the driveway seemed to swallow him up, and in a few minutes the car was gone. I walked to the kitchen window and watched the dust settle where the tires had been. There was a moment of silence I could almost hold in my hand, a clean, restful thing. After he'd gone, I finished tightening my hinge. I'd been working on earlier, not out of spite, but because that's what keeps a house sound. I put the screws in with steady hands and tested the cabinet door, listening to the soft, correct sound of it closing. It was the little noises that told you a place was whole. Evening came with a kind of forgiveness folded into it. I made tea and wrapped Linda's old shawl around my shoulders. It's the one she kept on the back of the armchair, the one with the faded pattern of tiny flowers that had followed us through winters and summers. Sitting on the porch, the shawl felt like a map of the life we'd sewn together, a comfort worth wearing proudly. The roses she'd planted years ago were in bloom, their faces open and bright, even as the sun started to drop. I could smell the faint sweetness on the breeze, and for a moment the sound of her humming rose in my memory and stood there like something safe. I sat and watched the sky change colors, the way it always had over this house. First amber, then rust, then that soft purple that comes before night. People speak of peace like it's a loud thing, like a banner you raise. But peace is quieter. It's the slow return of things to their proper order. It's the hinge that no longer squeaks. It's the creak of the porch where a board finally settles the right way. It's the knowledge that truth has done its job. I didn't think about revenge. There was no appetite in me for spectacle. Linda's will had done the work that needed doing. It had been practical, honest, and final. It had protected the life we built. That felt like more than enough. As the light faded, neighbors waved from their own porches. Mrs. Hargrove shouted over a hello, that the pie she'd baked was for me when I had a chance to come by. Little things appeared. The small kindnesses of a town that remembers the hands that built its houses. The world went on as it does. I thought about Mark in the darkening distance, and felt a complicated tenderness. He'd made mistakes. He'd made choices that hurt. But he was my son, and the long arc of being a parent has a way of making room for both the sorrow of what's lost, and the hope that people learn. Maybe he would. Maybe he wouldn't. I had to let him walk his own path. The house, though, the house would remain a place where the past and present touched, where memories could be dusted and kept. I took another sip of tea, and felt the shawl slip a little at the shoulder. The air smelled of roses and wood smoke in the far distance, the kind of mixed smell that says a night is coming on and the world is softening. I breathed in deep and felt for the first time in months something like relief that wasn't edged with anxiety. The house was back where it belonged. The roses bloomed as Linda would have liked, and the hinge didn't squeak when I opened the cabinet. Love builds homes. Greed tries to take them. But truth always finds its way back. The sunset pulled the last color from the sky, and I sat there with the shawl around my shoulders until the porch light came on, and the house glowed softly from within. If my story means anything to you, if you've ever felt the ache of losing something you thought would always be yours, maybe you'll find a small comfort in knowing that patience and plain truth can be as strong as any shout. If this story touched you, please consider liking, sharing, or subscribing for more quiet stories of justice and resilience. It helps others find these gentle reminders that sometimes the kindest victories are the slow, steady ones. Thank you for sitting with me a while.